The sky is heavy with ash as snow falls silently over the battlefield. We are on the Eastern Front, December 1944. A young German soldier, just 19 years old, Hans Weber, is crouched in his makeshift trench. His hands tremble, not just from the biting cold that pierces his torn gloves, but from something deeper, something primitive, fear. The kind of fear Jung would describe as a direct connection to our ancestral unconscious, the one that links us to our forebears who faced predators on primordial savannas. Hans clutches his steel helmet tightly against his chest, an almost ritualistic gesture, as if the object could protect not just his head, but his soul. And then he hears it. First, a distant rumble, like thunder slowly approaching on the horizon. The metallic, rhythmic sound of treads advancing inexorably across the snow-covered plain. "The Shermans are coming," whispers the soldier beside him, a 40-year-old veteran who had seen too much. His words aren't just a tactical observation, they are the invocation of a mythical terror. To truly understand the psychological impact American Sherman tanks had on German troops during World War II, we need to delve into the depths of the human psyche under extreme stress. In 1943, as the first large contingents of Shermans began appearing on European battlefields, the Nazi propaganda machine still painted a picture of German technological supremacy. However, something very different was unfolding in the collective unconscious of Wehrmacht soldiers. The collective unconscious contains the entire spiritual heritage of humanity's evolution, reborn in the brain structure of every individual, wrote Carl Jung in Man and His Symbols. This concept is fundamental to understanding how the mere sighting of an enemy tank could trigger such deep and primal reactions. The account of Klaus Müller, a survivor from the 352nd Infantry Division, perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. It was as if we were no longer facing machines, but monsters from another world. We dreamed of them before we even saw them. Gigantic tanks pursuing us through endless forests, tanks transforming into mythological creatures. It was as if our unconscious already knew what was coming. Statistics from the era reveal that, in some German units facing large Sherman formations, cases of war neurosis increased by an astonishing 300%. The psychological phenomenon wasn't merely a result of American firepower, but of a far more complex confluence of psychic factors. We were witnessing what Jung would call an archetypal constellation, when powerful symbols emerge from the collective unconscious in moments of extreme psychological pressure. Let's return to our opening scene. Hans Weber feels the ground tremble beneath his feet. The sound of American tanks approaching is no longer just an acoustic phenomenon. It has transformed into a complete sensory experience that resonates with something deeply buried in his psyche. "They're invincible," murmurs another soldier, his face pale against the dark earth of the trench. "Shermans can be destroyed," replies the sergeant, trying to maintain morale. "But they always come back, always more." This perception of an enemy seemingly infinite in number and resources wasn't just a strategic observation. It was the manifestation of the devourer archetype, of the relentless force that Jung would identify as one of the primordial images present in myths and dreams across human cultures. For many German soldiers, especially after 1943, when the tide of war had definitively turned against Germany, the Sherman had become more than just a tank. It was the physical materialization of this ancestral archetype. A particularly interesting phenomenon documented by military psychologists of the era was what they called perceptual amplification. Soldiers frequently reported seeing Shermans larger than they actually were, more numerous, faster. Jung would explain this as a projection of the psyche, where internal fear manifests by literally altering external perception. "I saw them coming through the valley," reported Friedrich Keller, an artilleryman who survived the Battle of the Bulge. "They seemed twice their normal size.
Their treads left deep marks in the snow, as if they were giants. But the strangest thing was their barrels. They seemed to point directly at me, no matter where I hid. This sensation of being personally targeted, of a machine that seemed to possess its own predatory consciousness, reveals something profound about how the human psyche personifies its threats. Jung would observe that in moments of extreme stress, the line between object and symbol dissolves. The tank ceases to be merely an armored vehicle and becomes a physical manifestation of archetypal forces. Statistics show that even when German troops held numerical or positional superiority in certain engagements, the mere sighting of Sherman formations often precipitated premature retreats. Wehrmacht military documents reveal that field commanders reported increasing difficulty in holding positions when their men identified the approach of American tanks. In a Jungian analysis, we could say that the Sherman had become a symbol of collective shadow for the German soldiers, the personification of everything they had denied, the possibility of defeat, the fragility of their technological supremacy, the imminent end of their narrative of invincibility. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, the encounter with the shadow is a narrow passage, a tight portal whose painful narrowness no one is spared. If you're watching this video and have ever felt that primitive, unexplainable fear, the kind that seems to come from the depths of your being, you're experiencing the same psychic mechanism that operated on the battlefields of Europe. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had a recurring dream about something chasing you. We're exploring the same psychic territories Jung mapped. The psychology of war isn't just about strategies and tactics, but about how symbols and archetypes shape human experience on the battlefield. The impact of Sherman tanks on German troops offers us a unique window to observe these psychic processes in action, when the machine becomes myth and physical combat merely the surface of a much deeper battle occurring in the realm of the soul. As the war progressed, the psychological relationship between German soldiers and Sherman tanks evolved in a fascinating way. In 1943, the initial encounters primarily generated surprise and technical disdain. The Germans, confident in the superiority of their panzers, viewed Shermans as inferior in armor and firepower. But as 1944 unfolded, something profoundly shifted in the German collective imagination. First, we scoffed at them, reports Otto Schneider, a radio operator with the 2nd Panzer Division. We called the Shermans Ronzens because they easily caught fire when hit. But then they kept coming, always more, like a mythological hydra. For every tank destroyed, 5 more appeared on the horizon. This psychological transformation perfectly represents what Jung would call enantiodromia, the principle that any extreme psychic force eventually transforms into its opposite. German overconfidence converted into an almost superstitious terror. A military document recovered from the 116th Panzer Division's headquarters reveals an unusual order. Commanders must combat rumors about ghost tanks that supposedly appear out of nowhere. Such stories undermine morale and are the product of minds overstimulated by prolonged combat. This official order demonstrates how German military authorities struggled against a phenomenon that went beyond material reality. They were confronting manifestations of their own soldiers' collective unconscious. The chronological evolution of the Sherman's psychological impact can be divided into 3 distinct phases. In the first, technical disdain predominated. In the second, numerical dread, the perception of an inexhaustible force. In the third phase, the most interesting from a psychological standpoint, a phenomenon we could call the mythologization of the Sherman emerges. The personal diary of Captain Werner Herzog, found decades after the war, contains a revealing entry. My men have developed strange rituals. Before combat, some make 3 crosses on the ground. Others recite specific verses. Corporal Mueller insists he sighted a Sherman with eyes that glowed in the dark. The stress is driving us to collective madness. This process is precisely what Jung would describe in Psychology and Alchemy as the emergence of compensatory symbols when rational consciousness fails to integrate traumatic experiences. Soldiers, unable to rationally process the constant terror, resorted to deeper ancestral symbolic structures. Particularly notable were the recurring dreams reported by German soldiers in field hospitals. A study conducted by Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann documented that 37% of soldiers traumatized after encounters with American armored forces described similar dreams. Tanks metamorphosizing into mythical creatures, growing to impossible sizes, or possessing supernatural qualities. In Jungian terms, these dreams represent the psyche attempting to process and integrate the traumatic experience through the symbolic language of the unconscious. The Shermans had transcended their nature as physical objects and become carriers of archetypal meaning. Sergeant Wilhelm Brandt's survival testimony perfectly illustrates this dimension. "We were cornered near St. Lo. Our tank was hit, but I managed to escape. I spent 3 days hiding in an abandoned farmhouse, listening to the Shermans passing. It was as if they were looking for me personally,
As if they could sense my presence. At night, I dreamed of them transformed into metallic wolves hunting through the forest." This personification of the machine, this attribution of almost conscious intentionality to an inanimate object, is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that Jung would explain as the projection of aspects of the personal and collective shadow. If you're enjoying this analysis of war psychology from a Jungian perspective, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos where we explore archetypal patterns in different conflicts throughout history. Military statistics show that in some German units, the desertion rate significantly increased after confrontations with Sherman formations, not during the fighting itself, but in the subsequent 72 hours. This detail is crucial. It suggests that the deepest psychological impact wasn't immediate, but occurred during the later psychic integration of the experience, as initial defense mechanisms began to falter. The deepest point of psychological transformation for German troops occurred during Operation Cobra in July 1944, when over 2,500 American tanks, mostly Shermans, broke through German lines in Normandy. Witnesses describe an almost apocalyptic vision. The entire horizon seemed to move, an unbroken metallic mass advancing inexorably. It was at this moment that the psychological impact reached its climax, a moment Carl Jung would describe as a collective, numinous experience, when the conscious ego is confronted with such an overwhelming force that the mind's rational structures simply collapse. "It wasn't a war anymore," wrote Lieutenant Karl Wagner in a letter he never sent, found on his body. "It was as if the earth itself had turned against us, as if we were fighting elemental forces and not men. The Shermans seemed to be born from the very ground, unstoppable like a flood." This poetic, almost mystical language isn't accidental. It represents the psyche seeking transcendental terms when literal reality becomes psychologically unprocessable. It's what Jung would call the activation of the archetypal unconscious in moments of extreme crisis. Striking statistics reinforce the dimension of the trauma. During the German retreat after Operation Cobra, military doctors documented a 470% increase in cases of acute psychiatric disorders. Even more telling, 63% of these cases presented similar symptoms. Auditory hallucinations involving the characteristic sound of Sherman engines, recurring nightmares, and a specific phobia of open spaces where tanks might appear. In Jungian terms, we were witnessing the spontaneous development of what we could call a collective complex, a psychic structure charged with emotional energy organized around a central theme. The Sherman complex, as some military psychologists later named it, represented a constellation of fears, projections, and archetypal responses that had crystallized in the German collective psyche. Particularly fascinating is how this complex manifested through sensoriality. Soldiers reported a specific hypersensitivity to the sound of Sherman engines, able to distinguish them from other tanks kilometers away.
Some developed what they called prey ear, a constant and exhausting auditory vigilance. The strangest thing, reports Hans Schmidt, a doctor with the 9th Panzer Division, was how men could be sleeping deeply, exhausted after days without proper rest, yet instantly awaken at the slightest sound resembling a Sherman. It was as if some ancestral part of the brain, the one that alerts us to predators, had been specifically recalibrated. Jung would speak of this phenomenon as a manifestation of the prey archetype, a primordial psychic structure we carry from our ancestors who lived in constant vigilance against predators. The Sherman had become, in the German collective unconscious, the ultimate predator. One of the most ironic aspects of this psychological phenomenon was how it contrasted with technical reality. Shermans were, in many respects, inferior to German tanks in direct duels. A panther or tiger could easily destroy a Sherman in individual combat. Yet, in the realm of war psychology, such technical superiority became irrelevant. Symbolic power had completely supplanted literal power. The way this paradox affected the German psyche is eloquently captured in General Hans von Salmuth's diary. Our tanks are technically superior, our gunners more precise, our tactical doctrine more sophisticated, and yet we retreat. It's as if we're fighting against something more than machines. We're fighting against a symbol, against the idea of American inexhaustibility, against the psychological certainty of defeat.
This observation precisely echoes what Jung discusses in Man and His Symbols, how active symbols can completely overpower rational and literal experience. The Sherman had become what Jung would call a living symbol, an image that carries and channels autonomous psychic energies. In the weeks following Operation Cobra, a curious phenomenon was documented among German troops, reports of ghost tank sightings, Shermans that appeared and disappeared, moved silently, or emerged in impossible locations. From a Jungian perspective, we were witnessing the manifestation of a profound psychic process. The constellation of an archetype had become so powerful that it began to generate autonomous perceptual experiences. Do you recognize this phenomenon in your own life? When the fear of something becomes so great that you start to see that thing everywhere. Tell me in the comments if you've experienced anything similar. At this critical point in the war, the psychological impact of the Shermans completely transcended their material reality. They had become, in the true Jungian sense, manifestations of the German collective shadow, the personification of everything the Germanic psyche had denied, its vulnerability, its finitude, the imminent end of a worldview sustained by the illusion of invincibility. Moving into the final phases of the war, between the autumn of 1944 and the spring of 1945, we witnessed an even deeper transformation in the psychological impact of the Shermans on German troops, a process Jung would describe as the final phase of shadow integration, when prolonged encounter with a powerful symbol eventually leads to resignation and a kind of bleak acceptance. Documents recovered from the German High Command reveal a growing concern not just with Allied material superiority, but with a phenomenon that reports called paralysis of will in the face of American armored advances. A confidential memo from General Guderian in January 1945 notes, units that would previously fight to the last man now abandon defensibly viable positions at the first sign of approaching Sherman formations. The problem is no longer technical or numerical, but spiritual. This extraordinary observation precisely echoes the Jungian concept of how archetypal symbols can affect not just perception, but will itself, what Jung would call an archetypal possession. When the psychic energy associated with a symbol becomes so overwhelming that it virtually paralyzes normal ego functions. Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht communications officer, wrote in his personal diary in March 1945, "It's as if we could feel the Shermans before we even heard them. A peculiar tremor in the air, a restlessness that spreads among the men. We've developed a new sense, like animals sensing an imminent earthquake.
The young recruits call us superstitious until they themselves develop the same perception after a few weeks on the front lines. What Muller is describing, unknowingly, is what Jung would identify as a manifestation of the unconscious intuitive function, a form of perception that doesn't operate through conventional senses, but through a direct apprehension of the underlying meanings and patterns of material reality. Perhaps the most extraordinary psychological phenomenon of this late period was the development of a true war folklore surrounding the Shermans. Stories circulated among German soldiers about specific tanks that supposedly couldn't be destroyed, that appeared in multiple sectors of the front simultaneously, or that were driven by almost supernatural figures. The tank with the white bull insignia, reported prisoner of war Ernst Hoffmann during an interrogation. We all knew it. Our anti-tank battalion claimed to have destroyed it 3 times, and yet it kept reappearing. Some believed it was always the same tank being repaired, others that the Americans deliberately painted the same symbol on different vehicles to demoralize us. But many were convinced there was something more, something we couldn't rationally explain. This account perfectly illustrates what Jung would describe in Psychology and Alchemy as the emergence of mythological motifs in periods of extreme collective psychic disintegration, when normal rational structures begin to dissolve and more primitive archetypal forms of understanding emerge to fill the void. As the German defeat became increasingly inevitable, the psychological impact of the Shermans began to transcend the purely military context and infiltrate German civilian consciousness. Accounts from civilians in the eastern areas of Germany describe recurring dreams about American tanks long before any actual presence of these in German territory, a phenomenon Jung would identify as the propagation of collective unconscious content through a kind of psychic contagion.
A particularly fascinating aspect of this final period was how the psychological impact of the Shermans decisively influenced the moral collapse of German forces. Military statistics reveal that in the war's final months, the surrender rate of German units facing Sherman formations was 340% higher than those facing other types of Allied forces. The account of Wilhelm Braun, a medical officer captured in April 1945, offers a glimpse into this phenomenon. I repeatedly treated the same men who returned from the front with identical symptoms: tremors, insomnia, a peculiar state of fatalistic resignation. It wasn't cowardice in the traditional sense. It was as if something fundamental had broken inside them. One soldier told me, "Doctor, it's not that I'm afraid to die. It's that it seems useless to resist something so relentless, so impersonal as a force of nature." This description directly points us to the Jungian concept of the numinous, when the human psyche encounters something it perceives as a direct manifestation of transpersonal forces, something that completely transcends normal categories of understanding. If you've been following this analysis so far, share this video with a friend interested in psychology or military history. We're exploring a fascinating territory where these two disciplines meet and illuminate each other. In the war's final days, documents from the German High Command reveal a last extraordinary psychological adaptation: explicit orders for field commanders to avoid using the term Sherman in communications with troops, suggesting instead euphemisms like enemy motorized vehicles or simply mobile artillery. This seemingly trivial detail reveals an intuitive understanding of something Jung would formally articulate: the psychic power contained in the very name of a charged symbol. The psychological legacy of this phenomenon persisted far beyond the war's end. Studies with German veterans conducted in the 1950s and 1960s documented that survivors of encounters with Sherman formations exhibited significantly higher rates of recurring nightmares and stress responses to specific stimuli, such as the sound of heavy engines or the sight of large vehicles, decades after the conflict ended. The psychological impact of Sherman tanks on German troops transcended the specific historical context of World War II, revealing itself as a fascinating case study on how the human psyche responds to symbols of overwhelming power under extreme conditions.
By reflecting on this phenomenon through the lens of Jungian psychology, we arrive at a much deeper understanding than would be possible through a purely military or historical analysis. In the immediate post-war period, psychologists working with German veterans noted a curious pattern. While traumas associated with bombings, infantry combat, or privations tended to gradually diminish over time, the specific psychological impact linked to encounters with Sherman formations often persisted unaltered, sometimes even intensifying with the years. Dr. Franz Neumann, a psychiatrist who treated hundreds of veterans in Hamburg during the 1950s, observed, "There is something qualitatively different about these specific traumas. It's not just the event itself, but how it was processed and integrated, or more precisely, not integrated, into the psyche. It's as if the event had opened a fissure in these men's psychic world, exposing them to something for which they had no adequate categories of understanding." This clinical observation precisely echoes what Jung describes in Psychology and Religion as the encounter with the holy other, an experience that transcends normal categories of consciousness and forces the psyche into a process of fundamental restructuring. Statistics compiled by the Munich Institute for Psychological Research in 1960 reveal surprising data. Among veterans who had faced different types of combat, those who had experienced direct confrontations with Sherman formations exhibited 278% higher rates of persistent post-traumatic stress symptoms, with a particularly high incidence of recurring nightmares, specific sensory flashbacks, and phobias related to large machinery. A particularly eloquent testimony comes from Gustav Fischer, a former anti-tank artillery officer interviewed in 1967. "I don't dream about the men I killed or friends I lost. I dream about them, the Shermans. Always the same sequence. First the sound, then the vibration in the ground, then they appear on the horizon, not as machines but as some primitive force. I wake up screaming even after all these years. It's not the war that haunts me, but that specific moment of realization, the moment you realize you're facing something that cannot be defeated." What Fischer is describing, unknowingly, is precisely what Jung would identify as an unintegrated archetypal encounter, when the psyche is confronted with a manifestation of archetypal energy so powerful that it cannot fully process it, leaving an unassimilated psychic fragment that continues to generate autonomous energy decades later. Perhaps the deepest psychological legacy of this phenomenon can be found not just in traumatized individuals, but in the collective transformation of German consciousness. Cultural historians note how the experience of technical impotence in the face of American mass production, personified by the Shermans, decisively contributed to the post-war restructuring of German industrial identity, with its renewed emphasis on superior quality rather than quantity. As the philosopher Ernst Jünger, a veteran himself, observed in 1955, "The war taught us that we couldn't compete with the American industrial titan on its own terms. This realization forced a profound transformation of our national self-image, from a nation that sought to dominate through brute force to one that would seek influence through technical excellence and precision." This observation perfectly captures what Jung would describe as the constructive process that can emerge after the traumatic encounter with the shadow, when the successful integration of a negative projection can lead to a healthier, more realistic restructuring of the psyche. On a broader level, the psychological impact of the Shermans on German troops offers us a unique window to observe what Jung would call the process of collective individuation, when not just individuals but entire cultures are forced to confront their shadows, their limits, and their illusions, emerging transformed from this painful but necessary encounter. The final statistics are striking. Over 49,000 Shermans were produced during the war, outstripping total German tank production by more than 5-1. But the true impact completely transcended the numbers. As a captured German sergeant succinctly put it during an interrogation, "You didn't just defeat us with your tanks, but with what they represented, the absolute, inescapable certainty that we couldn't win." If you found this exploration of war psychology through a Jungian lens interesting, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your participation is crucial for us to continue producing in-depth content like this.
To conclude this analysis of the mental impact of Sherman tanks on German troops, I'd like to offer a quote from Carl Jung himself that perfectly captures the essence of this extraordinary psychological phenomenon. When an external symbol coincides with an internal need, the effect is immediate, overwhelming, and impossible to resist. It's like an electrical current flowing to the point of least resistance. The symbol becomes a vehicle for archetypal energies that pierce conscious defenses as if they didn't exist. The Sherman tank, in its physical manifestation as a relatively common armored vehicle, transformed into something far more powerful in the psychic theater of war. It became a living symbol, a carrier of archetypal meanings, a catalyst for a collective psychic transformation whose reverberations we can feel even today. What this story ultimately teaches us is something profoundly Jungian, that the true decisive battles aren't fought just on physical fields with tangible weapons, but in the invisible realm of the human psyche, where symbols and archetypes wield a power that often completely surpasses material realities. It's a lesson that transcends the specific historical context of World War II and offers us valuable insights into the deeper nature of human experience, about how the psyche processes, integrates, and is transformed by encounters with forces that challenge our existing structures of understanding. The story of the Sherman's mental impact on German troops is therefore more than a curious chapter in military history. It's a window into the fundamental archetypal processes that shape not only our individual responses to trauma, but the collective transformations of entire cultures when confronted with the inevitable process of shadow integration that Jung identified as the core of the individuation process, whether for an individual or a nation.